After my father-in-law, Anthony Randall, has undergone a coronary artery bypass surgery, he decides to visit the company to inspect the new project. I've ordered the project department to prepare a stable, smooth-riding man basket. But what I receive is a dangerous-looking man basket that doesn't have any safety measures installed in it. Anisa Howell, the first love of my husband, Connor Randall, speaks up mockingly at that moment. Since your junk-collecting dad wants to collect more junk in the construction site, it's only natural that I, the person in charge of this project, hold the fort for Mr. Randall. Then again, I've always been a soft-hearted person. This man basket might be malfunctioning, but it's perfectly adequate to send you guys to your destination. Realization dawns on me immediately. Anisa must have mistaken Anthony as my actual dad, who works as a farmer in the countryside. I'm about to explain to her that Anthony has just undergone a heart surgery and cannot suffer from any emotional distress caused by any factors, including tall heights. But Anisa quickly commands her workers to shove us into the man basket before pulling down the lever, which will cause it to ascend rapidly. Poor Anthony has gone deathly pale from the fright. He keeps clutching at his chest hopelessly the whole time. But Anisa has the audacity to flaunt her privileges over the walkie-talkie. I'm a VIP of a bungee jumping club. Today, I'll let you have a taste of what it feels like to soar through the skies. The fierce wind scattered the words of the foreman, Howard Finch. Is it secured? The people up there are Mr. Randall's guests. But no one paid him any attention. The man basket shot upward at a speed far beyond its safety limit. My father-in-law, Anthony Randall, went limp from the sudden sensation of weightlessness, his knees slamming hard onto the rusted metal floor. I rushed over to hold him up. Dad, are you okay? Anthony's face had turned bluish-purple. His lips, hands, and eyes were all trembling. That trembling was actually a whole-body spasm associated with a heart attack. Wind howled in from every direction, and the basket swayed violently. Emergency stop. Press the emergency stop, I said. I went to hit the red button in the corner of the basket. I pressed it once, but nothing happened. I tried again, but there was still no response. I crouched down to check, and found that all the control cables had been cleanly severed. I grabbed the railing and screamed down at Anisa Howell. Anisa, are you out of your mind? From nearly 100 feet above the ground, I saw her sitting under a sun umbrella with her legs crossed, casually sipping a black iced coffee. Anthony's breathing grew rough and labored. I had only heard that sound once before, in the ICU. It was on the third day after his heart bypass surgery, the night he had nearly died. I pulled out my phone and called Connor Randall. He picked up after 3 rings. I screamed at the top of my lungs. Connor, get someone to stop the basket right now. Dad is having a heart attack. Connor stayed silent for 2 seconds. Anisa already told me that you brought your broke father to the construction site to make a scene. What's wrong with letting him stay up there for a while? If you keep causing trouble, forget about getting next month's allowance. Before I could say anything, he hung up. A loudspeaker below suddenly let out a piercing screech. Anisa's voice, blaring through the loudspeaker, echoed across the entire construction site. Hey, stop pretending to be dead, old man. Stand up and dance for me. Howard finally couldn't take it anymore. He threw off his hard hat and ran toward the electrical switch box. Anisa slapped him across the face. Who told you to touch that? If anyone dares to touch that switch today, I'll fire the entire crew. None of you will get a single dollar of your wages. No one dared to move again. The crosswind grew stronger, and the basket began to tilt at a terrifying angle. All I could do was hold tightly onto Anthony's arm to keep him from falling out of the flimsy cage. With a trembling hand, Anthony reached into his pants pocket and found his nitroglycerin pills. He twisted open the cap with shaking fingers, but a gust of wind suddenly hit, tilting the basket nearly 45 degrees. The medicine bottle slipped from his fingers, and the pills scattered everywhere. The bottle slipped through the wire mesh under our feet and fell straight down. It landed near Anisa's feet and bounced twice. The pills rolled across the dirt. I leaned over the edge of the basket, my voice already hoarse from shouting. Ms. Howell, lower us down now. Those are his life-saving pills. The wind carried my voice away in fragments, but Anisa still heard me. She glanced down at the pills by her feet, then lifted her right foot and stomped on them. She even twisted her foot hard, grinding all the pills into powder. Can a country bumpkin like him even afford medicine? She sneered. I bet these are just candy. Anisa bent down to check the bottom of her shoe, then scraped it against the ground with disgust. What terrible luck. My shoe is dirty now. Anthony had witnessed the whole thing clearly from above. His body began to convulse violently, and his eyes became bloodshot. I turned and reached for the steel cable on the outside of the basket. Dad, I'm going down to get the backup pills. Anthony grabbed my wrist and shook his head. He clamped down on my wrist with surprising strength, stronger than a 70-year-old sick man should have had. He didn't want me to take the risk. At that moment, a sharp electronic beep sounded from below. A black remote control appeared in Anisa's hand. Let me show you what weightlessness feels like. The basket's brake was released remotely. Without warning, the metal cage fell into free fall from nearly 100 feet in the air. My stomach shot up into my throat, and all I could hear was the wind and the chains shrieking as they rattled wildly. When the cage was about 33 feet from the ground, it stopped abruptly. The sudden inertia hurled Anthony and me forward like rag dolls. Anthony's forehead slammed hard against the iron railing, and blood gushed out immediately from the wound. His eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. Then his body went limp, and he passed out. His lips began turning black. I was on the verge of breaking down as I slapped his face hard. "Dad, wake up." I knelt in the basket, my knees hitting against the rusted metal floor with a dull thud. "Anisa, please let us down. I'll sign the divorce agreement right now and give up my place to you. I'll give you whatever you want." After hearing my words, Anisa laughed triumphantly. "You should have gotten lost a long time ago. But today's high-altitude roller coaster ride isn't over yet. Stay up there and suffer." She glanced at her watch. "Wait another half an hour. I have a nail appointment. I'll let you down when it's time." Half an hour was too long. Anthony couldn't even last another 30 seconds. I laid him out flat on the metal floor and knelt beside him to perform CPR. With every compression, I could hear an abnormal, hollow sound coming from his chest. His hands hung by his side, and his fingers still curved in the same shape from twisting the medicine bottle cap. I fumbled for my phone and dialed for emergency help. "I'm on tower crane number 3 at Randall Group's construction site in the Southern District. Someone is having a heart attack. Please send an ambulance immediately." The operator told me to stay on the line. Anthony's lips had already turned completely black. 8 minutes later, I heard the ambulance siren growing closer. Anthony finally had a chance. I leaned over the edge of the basket and saw the white ambulance stop at the site's main gate, unable to get in. 2 dump trucks loaded with dirt sat sideways, blocking the entrance. Anisa stood at the entrance with her arms crossed. "Who gave you permission to enter?" The paramedics jumped out of the ambulance and rushed forward with their medical kits. "We have a patient in cardiac arrest. Please move aside." Anisa didn't even blink. "This is a restricted Randall Group construction site. Outside vehicles need approval to enter. Your tires are filthy. If you track dirt onto the site, who's going to clean it?" The lead paramedic's eyes turned red with anger. "Do you realize you're killing someone?" Anisa pulled a stack of cash from her pocket and threw it straight at the paramedic's face. "It's just some old man from the countryside pretending to be dying. You people are making a huge fuss over nothing. This money is enough to cover his medical bills. If you delay Randall Group's construction schedule, can you even afford the losses?" The bills scattered in the wind, but no one picked them up. The dump trucks didn't move an inch. In the end, the paramedics had no choice but to carry the stretcher and medical kits over the nearby wire fence. The construction site was huge. It took 6 or 7 minutes just to run from the gate to the basket, but the critical window for resuscitating a cardiac arrest patient was only 4 minutes. From above, I watched the paramedics run desperately across the massive site, weaving around scaffolding and jumping over ditches. 5 minutes passed. I continued performing CPR on Anthony mechanically, but his chest no longer showed any response. Anisa unhurriedly pressed a button on the remote control, and the basket began to descend. It wasn't a smooth descent. Instead, the basket plunged into a sudden free fall. The entire metal cage crashed to the ground, sending dust and gravel flying everywhere. The impact sent me sprawling across the floor of the basket. I scrambled out of the basket, dragged Anthony out, and laid him flat on the ground. His forehead was still bleeding, but the color of the blood was no longer bright red. It had turned dark red, almost black. 2 paramedics finally reached us. The lead paramedic crouched down and felt for a pulse at Anthony's carotid artery. Then he looked up at me and slowly shook his head. "His pupils are dilated. This is sudden cardiac death. I'm sorry. He's gone." My hands were still frozen in the compression position, suspended midair. It felt as if all the sounds around me had suddenly vanished. Then I heard a sound that felt both distant and close, rising from my own throat. I held Anthony's body as it slowly grew cold and let out a wail. Anisa stood about 10 feet away, covering her nose as she stepped back. "He's dead, so what? Why are you screaming like that? You sound like a maniac. This is such bad luck." When Anisa saw that Anthony was indeed dead, she showed no fear at all. Instead, her expression was full of contempt and disgust. She started bossing the nearby workers around. "This old man died on our construction site just to extort us and bring us bad luck. You guys, go grab the filthiest tarp you can find on this site and cover up this old man. I don't want to look at him. Then call a tow truck and get him taken to the crematorium to be burned right away." The workers glanced at one another, and none of them dared to move. Anisa couldn't be bothered to spare me another glance and turned away to touch up her lipstick. 20 minutes later, a black Maybach pulled up at the entrance of the construction site. Connor stepped out of the vehicle. He wore a crisp suit and held a blue Tiffany paper bag. Anisa jogged over and threw herself into his arms. "Mr. Randall, you're finally here. You have no idea what happened. Your wife brought her broke old dad to the site to cause trouble. When he couldn't squeeze any money out of us, he lay on the ground and pretended to be dead just to scare me. My heart nearly gave out. Connor looked down and smoothed her wind-tousled hair. Then he looked toward me, or rather at the shape covered by a dirty tarp beside my feet. He walked over, stood beside the tarp, and glanced down. The tarp didn't fully cover the body, and one hand stuck out. A watch rested on that wrist. It was from the Patek Philippe Nautilus series, and only 50 pieces were ever produced worldwide. Yet Connor didn't notice the watch. He stepped directly onto that exposed hand. He looked down at me, his gaze cold. Listen carefully. Not only are you useless, but your dad is also a scheming old fraud. Sign the divorce agreement and get out right now. Don't dirty my property with your disgusting father. I stopped crying and lifted my head, staring at his foot on Anthony's hand. I spoke slowly and deliberately. You're stepping on your own father. Connor froze for a moment. Then he burst out laughing as if he had just heard the most ridiculous joke in the world. Sylvia Bradford, are you out of your mind? Or has grief completely fried your brain? My dad is doing just fine at a top-tier care facility in Urena. Does a country bumpkin like your dad even deserve to pose as my dad? Before he could finish speaking, the roar of engines echoed in the distance. It wasn't just one car that arrived, but more than a dozen. A row of black Hummers rolled in like a steel serpent along the road, ramming through the dump trucks blocking the entrance. The security guards tried to stop them, but the man in black at the front flashed a badge. At a glance, the guard's knees buckled. The convoy stopped in a semicircle at the center of the construction site. The door of the vehicle in the middle swung open, and a middle-aged man in a gray suit scrambled out in panic. I recognized him. He was the Randall family's head butler, Martin Duffy. Martin ran to the tarp and dropped to his knees with a thud. With trembling hands, he yanked away the filthy cover, revealing Anthony's face, which remained majestic and familiar despite being covered in blood. Mr. Randall, look. This is Mr. Randall Sr., Martin said. Connor's laughter stopped abruptly. He stared at the face of the man he had looked up to for 30 years. The Tiffany bag slipped from his grip and hit the ground with a dull thud. A diamond necklace slid out of the box and landed in the dust. His knees began to shake, and then he collapsed to the ground. The silence that settled over the construction site was heavier than the tons of concrete hanging from the nearby cranes. Connor remained on his knees in the red dirt, his breath hitching in his throat, as if the air had turned to glass. His eyes were locked on the face revealed. Beneath the grease-stained tarp, the distinguished silver hair, the sharp, patrician nose, the deep laugh lines around the eyes that had hardened into permanent grimaces of agony, there was no mistaking him. It was Anthony Randall, the titan of the Randall Empire, the man whose signature moved billions across global markets. His father. No. Connor whimpered, his hands hovering inches above the corpse, shaking violently. No, this is a mistake. Dad is at the St. Jude Recovery Sanitarium in Urena. He's in a private suite. I spoke to his doctor 2 days ago. Your father discharged himself yesterday morning, Mr. Connor. Martin Duffy's voice was as cold and sharp as a scalpel. The elderly butler stood over Connor, his eyes brimming with tears of fury and grief. He wanted to surprise you. He wanted to see if the Southern District project you begged him to fund was worthy of the Randall name. He asked Mrs. Randall to accompany him because he trusted her judgment more than anyone else in the family. Martin slowly turned his gaze down to Connor's expensive leather boot, which was still resting against Anthony's lifeless fingers. And you, Martin said, his voice dropping into a register that made the armed guards behind him shift into rigid attention, stepped on the hand that pulled you out of the gutter, raised you, and gave you everything you own. Connor pulled his foot back as if he had stepped on a white-hot coal, scrambled backward in the dirt, tearing his custom suit trousers on the jagged gravel. I didn't know. Connor screamed, clutching his head. Sylvia told me she brought her father. She said her father was here. I stood up slowly. My knees were bruised, my palms scraped raw from attempting chest compressions on a dead man for 15 agonizing minutes. I looked down at Connor, my eyes completely dry. The tears had stopped the moment Anthony's heart gave its final, shuddering beat. What was left inside me was a vast, frozen wasteland. I told you over the phone, Connor. I said, my voice eerily steady. I told you. Dad was having a heart attack. I screamed it. And what did you say to me? Connor's face went from pale to the sickly gray of curdled milk. What's wrong with letting him stay up there for a while? If you keep causing trouble, forget about getting next month's allowance. The words hung in the dusty air between us like a noose. Beside the Maybach, Anisa Howell was trembling so hard that her designer sunglasses slipped from her fingers and shattered against the asphalt. Her bright red lipstick looked grotesque against her bloodless skin. Connor. Anisa stammered, taking a tiny, hesitant step backward toward her sports car. She's lying. She tricked us. Why would Mr. Randall come here? Dressed in an ordinary windbreaker? Why didn't he announce himself? She set this up. She wanted us to make a mistake. Martin didn't even look at her. He raised a single gloved hand. 2 security operatives in black tactical gear moved instantly. Before Anisa could reach her car door, they seized her by the arms, twisting them behind her, back and forcing her down onto her knees in the gravel beside Connor. Let go of me, Anisa shrieked, thrashing against their iron grip. Do you know who I am? I'm the chief director of this project. Connor, tell them to let me go. Shut up, a voice rasped. It wasn't Connor. It was Howard Finch, the site foreman. Howard stepped forward, holding his cheek where Anisa's slap had left a distinct crimson vein. He looked at Martin, then pointed a trembling, callous finger at the crane. She cut the emergency cables, Mr. Duffy, Howard said, his voice thick with rage. She brought a personal remote control. She sent the basket up to 100 feet, jammed the engine, and dropped it into free fall. When the old gentleman dropped his heart medicine, she stomped on the pills. She ground them into the dirt with her heel. Martin's breath hitched. He slowly walked over to the spot Howard indicated. There, half buried in the tire tracks of the heavy machinery, lay the crushed remnants of the nitroglycerin bottle, surrounded by white powder stamped into the mud by a high-heeled shoe. Martin knelt, picked up the shattered plastic cap with a clean handkerchief, and placed it inside an evidence bag. When he stood up, his face was terrifying. Lock the gates, Martin commanded. Nobody leaves this site. Call the state police, the Special Investigations Division, and Mr. Harrison Vance. Tell them Anthony Randall has been assassinated. Within 30 minutes, the Southern District construction site looked like a military perimeter. 6 police cruisers, 3 unmarked government sedans, and 2 forensic mobile units had sealed off every exit. The yellow crime scene tape fluttered violently. In the wind around tower crane number 3, the medical examiner, Dr. Raymond Shaw, a man who had been Anthony's personal physician for 2 decades, stood over the body with his equipment case open. His hands were shaking as he zipped the heavy black body bag. The blunt force trauma from the 30-foot drop caused acute thoracic deceleration, Dr. Shaw reported to the lead detective and Martin. His newly grafted coronary bypass tore at the proximal anastomosis. But that didn't kill him instantly. The lack of sublingual nitroglycerin and the subsequent 5-minute delay in basic life support caused massive myocardial infarction and cerebral hypoxia. He suffered unimaginable terror and pain for at least 12 minutes before cardiac arrest. Dr. Shaw turned his furious gaze toward Connor, who was sitting on the bumper of a police cruiser, wrapped in a shock blanket. He called out for you, Connor. Dr. Shaw spat. In his final moments, his brain was starved of oxygen, and he was clutching his chest, calling his son's name. And you were buying diamond necklaces for a third-rate subcontractor. Connor buried his face in his hands, letting out a jagged, animalistic sob. Didn't know. God, please, I didn't know. You didn't care, I said, walking past him toward the black Rolls-Royce that had just arrived at the scene. A tall, austere man in a bespoke 3-piece charcoal suit stepped out of the vehicle. Harrison Vance, the managing partner of Vance and Sterling Legal and the sole executor of the Randall Family Trust, carried a thick, wax-sealed leather portfolio under his arm. He walked past Connor without sparing him a glance, stopping directly in front of me and Martin. Sylvia, Harrison said softly, bowing his head in profound respect. My deepest condolences. Anthony spoke to me yesterday afternoon before he departed Urena. He had a premonition that his recovery would not be smooth, and he wanted all documentation finalized. Harrison turned around and looked at the crowd of police officers, forensic technicians, and the detained Howell family members who had just arrived at the gates demanding Anisa's release. Detective Miller, Harrison said in a clear, carrying voice, I am handing over the black box data from the tower crane, along with the audio logs of the communications between this site and Mr. Connor Randall's personal phone. Furthermore, I am formally entering Mr. Anthony Randall's last will and testament into immediate effect. Connor looked up through swollen, bloodshot eyes. The will that Dad left the group to me. I'm the only son. Harrison looked at him with sheer disgust. 3 years ago, Connor, when your father allowed you to marry Sylvia, you signed a family compact. Under Section 14 of the Randall Dynasty Trust, any heir who engages in gross moral turpitude, criminal negligence resulting in harm to family members, or intentional abandonment of filial duties is instantly and irrevocably stripped of all inheritance rights, executive titles, and trust disbursements. Harrison unclasped the portfolio and pulled out a document stamped with the gold seal of the Supreme Court. As of 2:15 p.m. today, upon the certified pronouncement of Anthony Randall's death, Connor Randall is removed as CEO, stripped of his 42% equity interest, and barred from entering any Randall Group property. Connor stumbled to his feet, the blanket falling into the dirt. No. You can't do that. That's my birthright. Who else could possibly run the empire? Harrison turned to me and bowed deeply. Under the explicit terms of the revised trust, Anthony Randall has transferred 51% of the voting stock, the entirety of the primary liquid estates, valued at $8.4 billion, and the seat of executive chairwoman of the board, to his legal daughter-in-law, Sylvia Bradford Randall. The silence that followed was broken only by Anisa's high-pitched, hysterical laughter. Anisa shrieked from where she was pinned against the hood of a squad car. A farmer's daughter from the northern hills? She doesn't even know how to read a balance sheet. Connor, she forged it. She used your father's dementia to steal the company. My father did not have dementia, Miss Howell, Harrison Vance said, stepping toward her. And as for Sylvia's background, her father was not a simple farmer. Her father was Frank Bradford, the structural engineer who designed the very foundation of the Randall Tower 25 years ago and died saving Anthony Randall from a collapsed tunnel. Harrison's eyes narrowed into cold daggers. Anthony spent 20 years searching for Frank's daughter to repay that debt of life. When he found her, he saw that she had inherited her father's brilliant mind, graduating top of her class in civil and structural engineering from MIT. Under a full academic scholarship, she hid her qualifications and stayed at home for 3 years solely because Connor Randall insisted he wanted a traditional, docile wife. Connor stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. For 3 years he had treated me like a decorative piece of furniture. He threw an allowance at me every month like he was feeding a stray dog, mocked my plain clothes, and told his wealthy friends that he had married a country girl. Out of charity. He had never once asked to see my degrees. He had never once asked why his father consulted me on every major architectural acquisition the group made. Sylvia. Connor choked out, stumbling toward me. Sylvia, you can't leave me with nothing. We're husband and wife. Everything we have is shared. Shared? I looked at him, feeling an almost clinical detachment. Martin, what is the status of the Howell Construction subcontractors? Martin stepped forward with an iPad. Howell Construction has 4 active sub-agreements with the Randall Group, totaling $180 million. They used forged material inspection certificates, supplied substandard steel for the Southern Project, and billed $40 million in fraudulent labor hours, all signed off by Connor Randall and Anisa Howell. Cancel the contracts immediately, I ordered, my voice ringing across the yard. Seize their performance bonds. Freeze all accounts associated with Howell Construction, and file an emergency injunction to liquidate their corporate assets to cover the demolition of the substandard structures. Anisa's face drained of color. No. That's my family's entire company. If you do that, we'll be bankrupt by tomorrow morning. You won't have to worry about bankruptcy, Ms. Howell, Detective Miller said, stepping up behind her and clicking cold steel handcuffs around her wrists. You are under arrest for first-degree murder, reckless endangerment, criminal tampering with industrial machinery, and intentional deprivation of life-saving medical aid. You won't be needing money where you're going. As the officers dragged Anisa toward the cruiser, she kicked and screamed like a madwoman. Connor, save me. Tell them you authorized it. Tell them you told me to teach her a lesson. Connor didn't move. He stood frozen in the dust, watching the woman he had abandoned his father for being shoved into the back of a police car like a common felon. The news of Anthony Randall's death hit the financial markets at 4 p.m. By 4:30 p.m., the Randall Group's stock had plunged 17%. Rumors were swirling that the company was in a leadership vacuum and that rival conglomerates were preparing a hostile takeover. At 5 p.m., an emergency meeting of the board of directors convened on the 68th floor of the Randall Tower. Connor was already there. He had washed the dirt from his face, changed into a spare suit from his office, and surrounded himself with 3 senior board members who had long been his drinking companions, men who had grown fat off the unregulated kickbacks Connor routinely funneled their way. Gentlemen, Connor said, slamming his hand onto the mahogany conference table, his voice shaking with nervous energy. My father's death is a tragedy, but we cannot allow the company to fall into chaos. The will Harrison Vance produced is clearly fraudulent. My legal team is already filing an emergency injunction to contest it. In the meantime, as the sole blood heir, I am declaring myself interim chairman. You are declaring yourself a trespasser, Mr. Randall. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. I walked in. I was no longer wearing the dirt-stained clothes from the construction site. I wore a tailored black wool suit, my hair pulled back into a severe sleek bun. Behind me walked Martin Duffy, Harrison Vance, and 6 federal auditors carrying metal cases filled with financial ledgers. The 3 corrupt board members instantly stood up, scowling. Sylvia. Director Thomas barked. This is a closed executive session. You have no standing here. Security, remove this woman. Security reports to the chairwoman of the trust, Director Thomas, Martin said, calmly, stepping forward and placing a security roster on the table. And as of 20 minutes ago, the security detail on this floor has been replaced by the state marshals. 2 armed marshals stepped into the room, taking positions at the door. Connor's face twitched. Sylvia, stop this farce. You don't know the first thing about running a multinational corporation. If you take the helm, the stock will crater to zero by tomorrow morning. The stock will crater because you and your cronies have embezzled $320 million through the Howell subcontracting shell companies over the last 18 months, I said, dropping a thick red binder directly in front of Director Thomas. Thomas's eyes widened as he flipped through the first few pages. Bank routing numbers, Cayman Island holding accounts, wire transfers bearing his personal signature. This is confidential banking data. Thomas stammered. This is evidence collected by Anthony Randall over the last 6 months. Harrison Vance stated coldly. Anthony knew the group had a cancer. He had bypass surgery not just for his heart, but to buy himself enough time to excise the rot from this boardroom. He left the scalpel in Sylvia's hands. I walked to the head of the table, pulling out the grand leather chair that had belonged to Anthony for 30 years. I didn't sit in it. I stood behind it, resting my hand on the carved mahogany crest. Directors Thomas, Vance, and Miller, I said, looking at each of them in turn. You have 30 seconds to sign your voluntary resignations and surrender your equity back to the Treasury at par value. If you refuse, the federal prosecutors waiting in the lobby will unseal the indictments for corporate fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit industrial manslaughter. Thomas dropped his pen. His hands shook so violently that he couldn't even meet my gaze. One by one, the 3 men pulled the resignation letters Harrison provided and signed their names with trembling strokes. Get out, I said. The 3 directors scurried out of the room like rats fleeing a flooding hold. Only Connor remained, standing alone on the opposite side of the long table. Sylvia. Connor whispered, his voice cracking into a desperate whine. Please. I made a mistake with Anisa. She seduced me. She manipulated me. But we've been married for 3 years. You loved me once. I loved the man I thought you were, I replied, looking straight through him. I loved the man who pretended to honor his father, who pretended to care about the people who built this company. But you were never that man. You were just a hollow parasite living inside Anthony Randall's shadow. I pulled a pen from my pocket and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Sign the divorce papers, Connor. You walk away with the clothes on your back and the watch on your wrist. If you fight me, Harrison will ensure you are named as an unindicted co-conspirator in Anisa Howell's murder trial. Connor looked down at the divorce settlement. 0 alimony, 0 property division, total forfeiture of all Randall Trust claims. Tears streamed down his cheeks, dripping onto the pristine white paper. He knew. He was beaten. He knew that every door in the city, every bank, every social club, and every corporate boardroom was now closed to him forever. With a shaking hand, he picked up the pen and scribbled his name. The trial began 4 months later. Amidst an unprecedented media frenzy, the courtroom was packed to capacity every single day. Reporters from every major national network lined the corridors, eager to capture every sordid detail of the high-altitude execution that had shocked the business world. Anisa Howell sat at the defense table, but she was unrecognizable. The glamorous, arrogant socialite had vanished. Her hair was unwashed and stringy, her face sunken and sallow, and she wore a plain orange prison jumpsuit. Her high-priced defense attorneys, hired by her now-bankrupt father, using their last hidden savings, looked exhausted and defeated before the opening statements had even concluded. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of forensic precision. Prosecutor Davis stood before the jury, holding up the remote control recovered from the dirt beneath the crane. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Davis said, his voice echoing through the vaulted courtroom. The defense claims this was an unfortunate industrial accident. They claim Ms. Howell was merely an inexperienced manager dealing with an unruly trespasser. But the data does not lie. Davis clicked a button, and the giant monitor on the courtroom wall illuminated. This is the black box telemetry from the crane's hoisting mechanism. At 1:14 p.m., the emergency governor was manually overridden. The speed was increased to 300% of the maximum safety rating. At 1:18 p.m., the brake was fully disengaged from the ground, causing a free fall of 67 feet before being abruptly clamped Davis then played the walkie-talkie audio recording recovered from the foreman's radio. I'm a VIP of a bungee jumping club. Today, I'll let you have a taste of what it feels like to soar through the skies. Hey, stop pretending to be dead old. Mun. Stand up and dance for me. A collective gasp swept through the jury box. Several jurors looked at Anisa with expressions of open horror and disgust. Then came the medical evidence. The crushed nitroglycerin bottle. The forensic casting of the sole of Anisa's high-heeled shoe, showing an exact microscopic match with the chemical residue on the concrete. And finally, the testimony of Connor Randall. Connor was brought in from the county jail, wearing handcuffs and a standard inmate uniform. He had been charged with felony criminal negligence and corporate embezzlement in a separate proceeding, and he looked like a broken shell of a man. Taking the witness stand, Connor didn't even look at Anisa. Did Ms. Howell inform you of Mr. Anthony Randall's condition on the crane? The prosecutor asked. She called me, Connor testified, his voice dead and monotonous. She told me Sylvia had brought a dirty old farmer to the site to extort money. She told me she was going to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. She asked me if she had full authority to handle the situation, and I told her to do whatever she wanted as long as it kept them away from me. Objection. Anisa's lawyer shouted, jumping up. The witness is testifying under a plea bargain agreement. Overruled. The judge said coldly. Anisa suddenly lost all control. She lunged across the defense table, her chained hands clawing toward Connor's face. You coward, she screamed, spit flying from her mouth. You knew. You hated your father. You always complained that he treated you like an idiot. You wanted him dead just as much as I did. You told me that once he was gone, we would run the world together. Connor flinched, shrinking back into the witness chair, tears streaming down his face. I never told you to kill him. You murdered my father. You destroyed my life. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly. Order. Bailiffs, restrain the defendant. It took 4 bailiffs to force Anisa back into her chair. The jury took less than 45 minutes to reach a verdict. On the count of murder in the first degree with depraved indifference, we find the defendant, Anisa Howell, guilty. On the count of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, guilty. On the count of criminal tampering and obstruction of emergency services, guilty. The judge looked down from the bench with zero mercy in his eyes. Anisa Howell, your actions displayed a level of callous cruelty and absolute disregard for human life that borders on the monstrous. You tortured an elderly, recovering surgical patient for your own petty amusement and vanity. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served at the maximum security facility in Gatesville. Anisa let out a blood-curdling scream, collapsing onto the floor as the bailiffs dragged her away. Her shrieks could be heard echoing down the marble hallway, long after the heavy courtroom doors had swung shut. 6 months after the trial, I drove out to the state penitentiary on the outskirts of the capital. The visitation room was cold and smelled of floor wax and stale sweat. A thick sheet of reinforced plexiglass separated the visitor booths from the inmate stalls. I sat down on the metal stool, placing the receiver to my ear. A few moments later, a guard escorted Connor to the other side. He was thin, so thin that his prison uniform hung off his shoulders like a shroud. His hair had turned completely gray at the temples, and his face was mapped with scars from prison yard fights. His former arrogance, his polished charm, his expensive grooming, all of it had been burned away by the brutal reality of prison life. He picked up the phone with a trembling, calloused hand. Sylvia, he whispered, his voice cracking. You came. I came to deliver this, I said, pressing a legal document against the glass. It was the final decree of probate closure. Anthony Randall's estate had been fully settled. The Randall Foundation had endowed 3 new cardiovascular research centers in the state, and the Southern District project had been completed, renamed the Anthony Randall Memorial Tech Hub. The project is finished, Connor, I said calmly. We tore down the substandard foundations your friends poured. We rebuilt it from the bedrock up. Howard Finch is now the senior site director for the entire southern region. Connor's eyes filled with bitter, burning tears. I'm in here for 8 years, Sylvia, he sobbed, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. 8 years for the embezzlement charges. When I get out, I'll have nothing. No family, no money, no home. I'll be 42 years old, sleeping in homeless shelters. You have your life, Connor, I replied, my voice completely devoid of hatred, which is more than you gave your father. Do you know what haunts me every night? Connor choked out, his fingers clawing at the glass. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the crane chains rattling. I see Dad's hand sticking out from that dirty tarp. And I remember my boot stepping on his fingers. I stepped on his hand, Sylvia. I stepped on my own. father's body and laughed. He began to weep uncontrollably, his shoulders shaking in violent spasms. Please, just tell me he forgives me. In your dreams, did he ever say anything? Did he leave a message for me before he died? I looked at him through the glass. I remembered Anthony's final moments, the terrifying drop, the blood pooling from his forehead, the way his fingers had stubbornly clamped down on my wrist to prevent me from risking my life to climb down the cables. He didn't leave a message for you, Connor, I said softly. In his final moments, he wasn't thinking about your inheritance or your excuses. He was just a father realizing that the son he loved was a stranger. I hung up the phone. Connor screamed into the receiver, pounding on the glass with both fists, begging me to pick it back up, but the sound was completely muffled by the heavy acrylic pane. 2 guards grabbed him by the arms, forcing him back through the heavy steel door into the gray labyrinth of the prison blocks. I stood up, smoothed the front of my black coat, and walked out into the crisp, clean morning air. A year to the day after Anthony's death, the city held a memorial dedication at the completed Anthony Randall Memorial Tech Hub. The plaza was filled with thousands of people. Blue-collar workers in clean hard hats stood side by side with city officials, engineers, and researchers from the newly established Cardiac Institute. In the center of the plaza stood a bronze statue of Anthony Randall. He was depicted not in a luxury business suit, but in his simple windbreaker and hard hat, looking out over the skyline with a warm, steady smile, the way he had looked when he visited the job sites in his youth. Howard Finch stood near the podium, dressed in his finest Sunday suit, his eyes misty as he looked up at the monument. He was a good man, Mrs. Randall, Howard said to me as I approached. A man who knew the value of a hard day's work and the worth of an honest worker. He was Howard, I smiled softly, and he would be proud of what you and the team built here. Harrison Vance and Martin Duffy walked up beside me, handing me a pair of gold-plated ceremonial shears for the ribbon cutting. The board has just approved the international expansion into the European green infrastructure sector, Harrison reported quietly. The group's valuation has surpassed $12 billion. The markets are completely stable, Chairwoman. Thank you, Harrison, I said. I stepped up to the podium. The cameras flashed and the crowd fell into a respectful silence. I looked out over the sea of faces, the honest, hard-working people who made this city breathe, the people Anthony had spent his life building for. I felt the cold wind blowing across the plaza, but this time, it carried no terror. It carried only the promise of a future built on truth, dignity, and unyielding strength. I looked up at the bronze statue of the man who had been more of a father to me than anyone in the world. To Anthony Randall, I said clearly into the microphone, lifting my gaze toward the vast open sky. Your foundation stands strong, and we will never let it fall. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, and as the white ribbon fell to the ground, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the steel and glass towers in brilliant, untamed light.